The wooden stairs creaked under my bare feet as I descended into our basement, each step echoing through the dimly lit space like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. The October air in suburban Cleveland had turned crisp, and down here, the chill seemed to seep through the concrete walls and settle into my bones. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. "Mia, come down here," Daniel had called from upstairs, his voice carrying that particular edge I'd learned to recognize over our 8 years of marriage. Not angry, exactly, but something sharper. Something that made my stomach tighten with familiar dread. The basement had always been his domain. While I tended to the bright, airy spaces upstairs, the kitchen with its yellow walls and herb garden on the windowsill, the living room where afternoon sunlight streamed through gauze curtains, Daniel claimed this underground territory as his own. His workshop occupied one corner, tools arranged with military precision on pegboards. His home office sat in another, where he spent hours on late-night calls with clients, his voice a low murmur through the floorboards above. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar space seemed smaller, the shadows deeper. "There you are," he said as I reached the bottom step. Daniel stood near his workbench, his tall frame silhouetted against the single overhead bulb. At 42, he still maintained the rigid posture from his military days, shoulders squared, jaw set in that way that meant he'd made up his mind about something. I stayed near the stairs, my hand resting on the wooden banister. "What did you need?" He turned then, and I saw something in his dark eyes that made me take an involuntary step backward. Not the usual frustration or disappointment I'd grown accustomed to seeing there, but something colder, more final. "We need to talk about your little plan," he said, moving closer with deliberate steps across the concrete floor. My heart began to race, though I kept my voice steady. "What plan?" "Don't." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me, Mia. Not after everything." The basement suddenly felt impossibly small. The walls seemed to press inward, and I became acutely aware of every detail. The musty smell of old cardboard boxes stacked in corners, the hum of the furnace in the far wall, the single narrow window near the ceiling that showed nothing but darkness beyond. "I saw you at Stephanie's yesterday," Daniel continued, his footsteps slow and measured as he approached. "Thought you were being clever, meeting there instead of here. Thought I wouldn't find out." Stephanie Martinez had been my lifeline these past months, the one person who listened without judgment when I finally found the courage to speak about the life I'd been living. A life that looked perfect from the outside, the colonial house in Shaker Heights, Daniel's successful accounting practice, my part-time work at the local library, our carefully maintained image at neighborhood barbecues and church potlucks. But Stephanie saw through the facade. She'd noticed the way I flinched when Daniel's hand moved too quickly, the careful way I chose my words when he was around, the gradual disappearance of friends and activities that had once brought me joy. "You've been filling her head with poison," Daniel said, now close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same expensive brand he'd worn since our wedding day. "Making her think she understands our marriage. She's just a friend," I managed, though my voice sounded thin in the enclosed space. "No." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Friends don't give you business cards for lawyers. Friends don't tell you lies about having options. The business card." My breath caught. I'd been so careful, hiding it in the back of my jewelry box, behind the earrings I never wore anymore. How had he found it? "You went through my things." It wasn't a question. I went through my wife's things. In my house. With my money that paid for every single item in that little jewelry box of yours. Each word was precise, controlled, but underneath I heard the familiar current of rage that had learned to flow so quietly I sometimes convinced myself it wasn't there at all. The basement grew smaller still. I glanced toward the stairs, calculating distance, but Daniel moved as if he could read my thoughts. He positioned himself between me and the steps, his tall frame blocking my path to the upper floor, to the world beyond these walls. 8 years, Mia. 8 years I've provided for you, protected you, loved you. And this is how you repay me. Sneaking around like some kind of criminal, plotting to destroy everything we've built together. Daniel, please, can we just go upstairs and talk about this? But he was shaking his head again, that same slow, deliberate motion. No, I think we're exactly where we need to be. Down here, where it's just you and me. Where we can have an honest conversation for once. The single bulb overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, making his features look sharp and unfamiliar. This was my husband, the man who'd courted me with flowers and poetry, who'd promised to love and cherish me in front of 150 guests at Sacred Heart Church. But standing here in the basement darkness, he felt like a stranger. "You know what your problem is, Mia." Daniel's voice had dropped to that whisper again, the one that somehow felt more menacing than shouting. "You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten that you're my wife. That you belong to me." He reached out then, his fingers brushing against my cheek with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about this moment. But that's okay. We all forget things sometimes. The important thing is that we remember. I wanted to pull away from his touch, but something in his eyes warned me to stay perfectly still. "What do you want, Daniel?" "I want you to understand something very clearly." His hand moved from my cheek to rest against the side of my neck. Not quite a caress, not quite a threat. "You are never leaving me. Do you understand? Never." The word hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Never. Final and absolute. "We're going to go upstairs now," he continued, his thumb tracing along my collarbone. "And you're going to call Stephanie and tell her you made a mistake. You're going to tell her that you and I worked everything out, that you were just going through a difficult time, but now you're better." "And the lawyer?" Daniel's smile was cold. "What lawyer?" "You never contacted any lawyer. You never had any intention of contacting a lawyer. Because you understand now, don't you, Mia? You understand that you'll never escape me." The words hit me like ice water. Never escape me. As if I were something captured, something caged. But even as fear coursed through me, something else stirred. Something that had been growing quietly during those conversations with Stephanie, during the sleepless nights when I stared at the ceiling and imagined a different life. Something that refused to be extinguished, even here in the suffocating darkness of our basement. "Do you understand?" Daniel asked again, his voice still that terrible whisper. I looked up at him, this man who'd been my world for so long I'd forgotten there was anything beyond it. And for the first time in years, I met his gaze directly. "Yes," I said quietly. "I understand." But what I understood had nothing to do with what Daniel thought he was teaching me. What I understood was that I was standing at a crossroads, and the choice I made in this basement, in this moment, would determine whether I spent the rest of my life in this darkness or finally found my way back to the light. Above us, the old house settled with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure weathering time and pressure. And somewhere in those familiar noises, I thought I heard something else. Something that sounded almost like hope. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Daniel went back to his routine, as if nothing had changed. Morning coffee while reading financial news on his tablet, 8 hours at the office, evening calls with clients while I prepared dinner in our yellow kitchen. But underneath the normalcy, I felt him watching me with a new intensity, cataloging my movements, monitoring my interactions. I called in sick to the library on Tuesday, claiming a migraine. The lie came easily, perhaps because it wasn't entirely untrue. My head pounded with the weight of unspoken words, and the autumn sunlight streaming through our living room windows felt too bright, too harsh against my skin. Stephanie texted me twice. "Haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" The second message, sent Wednesday afternoon, was more direct. "Call me." But Daniel was working from home that day, his laptop set up at the kitchen table where he could see me moving through the house. Every time my phone buzzed, his eyes flicked up from his screen to watch my face. By Thursday morning, I felt like I was suffocating. Daniel had left for the office by 7:30, kissing my forehead with what would have looked like affection to any outside observer. But I felt the pressure of his lips like a brand, marking territory, claiming ownership. I waited until 8:15 to be sure he was gone, then walked to our front window and peered through the gauze curtains. The street was quiet except for Mrs. Patterson walking her golden retriever and the distant sound of children's voices from the elementary school 2 blocks away. Normal suburban sounds. Safe sounds. My hands shook as I dialed Stephanie's number. "Mia!" Her voice was sharp with concern. "Where have you been?" "I've been worried sick." "I'm okay," I said, though the words felt like sandpaper in my throat. "No, you're not. What happened? Did he find out about the lawyer?" I closed my eyes, remembering Daniel's fingers against my neck, his whispered threats in the basement darkness. "Stephanie, I need to tell you something." "Tell me." But when I opened my mouth to deliver the speech Daniel had demanded, the explanation about making mistakes and working things out, different words emerged. Words I hadn't planned to speak. He knows. About you, about the business card. About everything. Silence stretched across the line. Then, Mia, where are you right now? Home. Is he there? No. He's at work, but I don't know for how long. He's been watching me, Stephanie. Every move I make, every conversation, every text message. Listen to me carefully. Stephanie's voice took on the authoritative tone she used in her job as a social worker. This is escalation. Do you understand what that means? I did understand, though I hadn't wanted to name it. The basement confrontation hadn't been an ending but a beginning. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. I should have listened to you weeks ago, I said, sinking into our plush living room sofa, the same one Daniel and I had picked out together during our 3rd year of marriage. Everything in this house held memories, some good, some complicated, all of them now tainted by the knowledge of what my life had become. Don't do that to yourself. You weren't ready then. The question is, are you ready now? Through the window, I watched a delivery truck turn onto our street. Such an ordinary sight, but it made me think about movement, about going places, about the world beyond these walls that Daniel had been slowly, systematically cutting me off from. The lawyer, I said. Is she still willing to meet with me? Patricia Morrison? Yes, of course. But Mia, we need to be smart about this. If Daniel is monitoring you as closely as you say, we can't risk him finding out about any meetings or calls. My mind raced through possibilities. Daniel knew my schedule, my habits, my friends. He checked our cell phone bill obsessively, questioned any unusual activity. But there were still gaps, small spaces in the surveillance. The library, I said suddenly. I'm supposed to go back to work tomorrow. I could meet her near there, during my lunch break. That could work. But what about afterward? If you're serious about pursuing this, there will be papers to sign, decisions to make. And once Daniel realizes what's happening, she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that the man who'd cornered me in our basement, who'd whisper those threats in the darkness, wouldn't simply accept divorce papers and walk away peacefully. There's something else, I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper, even though I was alone in the house. He said something that night about how I belonged to him. The way he said it, Stephanie, it wasn't just possessiveness. It was like he truly believes he owns me. That kind of thinking doesn't change overnight, Mia. Or at all, usually. Which is why we need to be extremely careful about how we handle this. A car door slammed somewhere on the street, and I jumped, my heart racing. False alarm, just Mrs. Patterson returning from her walk. But the spike of adrenaline reminded me how constantly on edge I'd become, how hypervigilant to every sound, every movement. I used to think I could fix this, I continued. Fix us. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was more understanding, more supportive, things would get better. That's not how abuse works, hon. It's not about what you do or don't do. It's about control. The word hung between us. Control. Such a simple concept, but it explained so much. The gradual isolation from friends, the monitoring of my activities, the way Daniel made every decision about our life together while making me feel grateful for his guidance. My mom used to say that marriage was about compromise, I said, thinking of my mother's voice, warm and certain. She died 4 years ago, never knowing how complicated my supposedly perfect marriage had become. But this isn't compromise, is it? No, sweetheart, it's not. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, looking out at our backyard where Daniel had built raised garden beds for my vegetables. Even that act of seeming kindness now felt differente, another way to keep me focused on home, on domestic concerns, on a small world where he was the center. Tomorrow, I said, making the decision as I spoke. I'll meet with the lawyer tomorrow. Are you sure? I'm sure that I can't keep living like this. I'm sure that what happened in the basement was just the beginning. And I'm sure that if I don't do something now, I never will. Okay, I'll set it up. Patricia Morrison, 1 o'clock, at that coffee shop on Cedar Road near the library. Can you make it look natural? I'll figure it out. Mia, one more thing. Don't tell Daniel about this conversation. Don't give him any reason to suspect what you're planning. Can you do that? I thought about the performance I'd been giving for years, the loving wife, the contented woman, the person who'd never dream of wanting anything beyond this house and this marriage. "I can do that," I said. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of our house and felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember, a sense of agency. For the first time in years, I was about to make a choice that was entirely my own, a decision that Daniel knew nothing about. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I spent the rest of the day moving through my usual routine: laundry, grocery shopping, preparing Daniel's favorite dinner. But underneath the familiar actions, I was planning, calculating timing, preparing for tomorrow. When Daniel came home that evening, I greeted him with a kiss and asked about his day. We ate dinner and watched the news together, his hand resting possessively on my thigh as we sat on the sofa. "You seem better today," he said during a commercial break. "More like yourself." "I am better," I replied, and realized it was true. Not because I'd accepted his version of reality, but because I'd finally remembered that there were other versions available. "Good," he said, squeezing my thigh. "I knew you'd come to your senses." I smiled and leaned against his shoulder, playing the role he expected while inside. A part of me that had been dormant for too long was finally stirring awake. Tomorrow would change everything. Tonight, I would let him believe he'd won. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Cleveland weather that seeps into your bones and stays there. I dressed carefully, nothing too formal that would raise Daniel's suspicions, nothing too casual that would seem inappropriate for work. The navy blue dress I chose was one he'd complimented before, safe and familiar. "I might be a little late tonight," Daniel mentioned over coffee, scrolling through emails on his phone. "Client wants to go over their quarterly projections." "No problem," I said, buttering my toast with steady hands. I was thinking of staying at the library a bit longer anyway. We're reorganizing the children's section. The lie came so easily it frightened me. When had I become someone who could deceive so smoothly? Daniel glanced up from his phone, studying my face with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Since when do you volunteer for extra hours?" My heart stuttered, but I kept my expression neutral. "Since Louise mentioned they might have to cut some part-time positions if we don't increase community engagement. I figured showing initiative couldn't hurt." He nodded, apparently satisfied. "Smart thinking. I always said you were good at reading situations." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. If I was so good at reading situations, how had it taken me 8 years to understand what mine really was? At the Cleveland Public Library's East Branch, I moved through the morning in a strange, split state of consciousness. Part of me cataloged returns, helped patrons find books, and processed new acquisitions with my usual efficiency. But another part counted down the hours until 1 o'clock with an anxiety so intense I worried it might be visible to everyone around me. "You okay, hon?" Louise Martinez, the head librarian, and coincidentally Stephanie's aunt, paused beside the circulation desk where I was scanning returned books. "You seem a little distracted today." Louise didn't know the full extent of my situation, but I suspected Stephanie had shared enough to make her watchful. There was something protective in the way she'd been scheduling my shifts lately, always making sure I worked days when other staff members were present. "Just tired," I said. "I think I'm coming down with something. Why don't you take a long lunch? Fresh air might help." I glanced at the clock. 12:15. "That's sweet of you, but I don't want to leave you short-staffed." "Mia." Louise's voice was gentle but firm. "Take the long lunch." She knew. Somehow she knew. I gathered my purse and light jacket, my hands trembling slightly as I signed out on the timesheet. The coffee shop on Cedar Road was only a 10-minute walk from the library, but I wanted to arrive early, to choose a table where I could see the entrance, to prepare myself for what was about to happen. The October air was crisp despite the earlier drizzle, and fallen leaves crunched under my feet as I walked. Such normal sounds, such an ordinary autumn day, but I felt like I was walking through a movie of someone else's life. The coffee shop was busy with the lunch crowd, business people grabbing sandwiches, students with laptops, elderly couples sharing pastries. I ordered a tea I didn't want and found a corner table where I could watch the door. At exactly 1 o'clock, Patricia Morrison walked in. Stephanie had described her, but I was still surprised by the woman's presence. Patricia was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat chignon and an understated confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a charcoal gray suit and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Our eyes met across the coffee shop, and she approached my table with a warm but professional smile. "Mia!" Her voice was exactly what I'd hoped for, strong, reassuring, completely unintimidated by the weight of other people's problems. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for meeting me. Patricia, please." She sat across from me, declining my offer to buy her coffee. "I have about an hour before my next appointment, so let's talk about your situation." I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, but actually speaking the words aloud proved more difficult than I'd anticipated. The story came out in fits and starts Daniel's increasing control over my activities, his monitoring of my communications, the basement confrontation, the growing sense that I was trapped in a life that no longer belonged to me. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in a small leather notebook. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but I caught glimpses of something harder in her eyes when I described certain incidents. "How long would you say this pattern of behavior has been escalating?" she asked when I finished. I thought about it carefully. The past 2 years, definitely. But looking back, I think it started much earlier. I just didn't recognize it as problematic. That's very common. Control often increases gradually, making it difficult to identify exactly when normal relationship dynamics cross into abuse. The word hung between us. Abuse. I'd been thinking it for months, but hadn't spoken it aloud until this moment. Is that what this is? Abuse. Patricia's expression softened slightly. What you're describing fits several patterns of psychological and emotional abuse. The isolation, the monitoring, the threats, the sense that you need permission to make basic decisions about your own life, these are all recognized forms of domestic abuse. Something inside me both broke and healed at the same time. The validation I'd been craving warred with the grief of finally accepting what my marriage had become. "What are my options?" I asked. Patricia opened her notebook to a fresh page. "Legally, you have several paths forward. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, which means you don't need to prove wrongdoing to file for dissolution of marriage. Given what you've told me about your husband's behavior, I'd recommend filing for divorce rather than dissolution, which gives us more legal protections during the process." "What kind of protections?" "Temporary restraining orders if necessary. Exclusive use of the marital home during proceedings. Financial support while the case is pending." She paused, studying my face. "But I need to be honest with you, Mia. Based on your description of your husband's reaction to your previous attempts to seek help, this process could be challenging." "Challenging how?" "Men who view their wives as property don't typically respond well to losing control of that property. We'll need to be strategic about how and when we serve papers, have a safety plan in place, and potentially involve law enforcement." The magnitude of what I was considering hit me fully. This wasn't just about signing papers and walking away. This was about dismantling a life, confronting a man who'd made it clear he wouldn't let me go easily, and rebuilding everything from nothing. "I'm scared," I admitted. "That's smart. Fear means you understand the stakes." Patricia leaned forward slightly. "But let me ask you something. What scares you more, the uncertainty of leaving or the certainty of staying?" The question cut straight through all my rationalizations and defenses. What scared me more was the growing conviction that the basement confrontation had been a preview of something worse to come. What scared me more was the thought of becoming someone who accepted threats and intimidation as the price of security. "The certainty of staying," I said quietly. "Then we move forward. But we do it carefully and we do it right." Patricia pulled a business card from her purse, writing something on the back. "This is my direct number. If you decide to proceed, call me and we'll schedule a longer meeting to discuss strategy and begin paperwork." I took the card, noting how different it felt from the one Stephanie had given me weeks ago. This one represented action rather than possibility. "How long does the process usually take?" "In Ohio, minimum of 30 days from service of papers to final decree, assuming no complications. But with assets to divide and potential custody issues. We don't have children." Something in my voice must have revealed the pain behind those words, because Patricia's expression gentled. "I'm sorry. Was that a choice or a circumstance?" "Daniel's choice, initially. He wanted to focus on building his practice first. Then it became about waiting for the right time, the right financial situation, the right moment that never seemed to come. Now, I shrugged, surprised to realize I felt more relief than regret. Now I'm grateful. I can't imagine trying to protect children through this. That may actually simplify certain aspects of the case. Patricia glanced at her watch. I need to head back to the office, but before I go, do you have somewhere safe to stay if you need to leave quickly? The question brought me up short. I'd been so focused on the legal aspects that I hadn't fully considered the practical ones. Where would I go? Daniel controlled our finances, knew all our mutual friends, had carefully cultivated relationships with my remaining family members. Stephanie has offered, I said slowly. That's good for a very short term, but if your husband is as controlling as you've described, he'll look there first. Do you have any family outside the area? Friends from before your marriage that he doesn't know about? I thought about my cousin Jennifer in Oregon, my college roommate Karen who'd moved to Austin. The life I'd had before Daniel gradually convinced me I didn't need anyone but him. Maybe I'd have to reconnect with people I haven't spoken to in years. Start making those connections now, casually. Don't explain why yet, just reestablish contact. You may need those relationships sooner than you think. Patricia stood to leave, then paused. One more thing, Mia. Once you make this decision, once we file those papers, there's no taking it back quietly. Your husband will know, and he will react. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Daniel's whispered words in the basement, about the cold certainty in his eyes, about the growing sense that I was living with a stranger who wore my husband's face. I'm prepared to stop living in fear, I said. Good. Patricia smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd shown. That's exactly the right answer. After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, staring at her business card. Around me, life continued its normal rhythm, couples sharing lunch, friends catching up over lattes, students studying for exams. Everyone seemed to inhabit their lives so naturally, so effortlessly. When had I stopped inhabiting mine? I walked back to the library through the October afternoon, feeling simultaneously more hopeful and more terrified than I had in years. The decision was made, even if I hadn't yet found the courage to act on it. But as I approached the library's front entrance, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Daniel's silver BMW was parked across the street, and through the windshield, I could see him watching the building, watching for me to return from a lunch break that should have ended 30 minutes ago. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly air as I stared at Daniel's car. He was on his phone, apparently engaged in conversation, but his eyes tracked movement around the library entrance with predatory focus. Think, Mia. Think. I ducked into the small alley between the library and the neighboring pharmacy, my heart hammering against my ribs. Patricia's business card felt like it was burning through my purse. How long had he been there? Had he seen me return from the wrong direction? My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Finished early. Thought I'd surprise you with lunch. My fingers trembled as I typed back. So sweet. Just grabbing some files from the back room. Give me 5 minutes. I forced myself to walk casually around to the library staff entrance, using my keycard with hands that shook only slightly. Inside, Louise looked up from her desk with concern. Everything all right, dear? You look pale. Daniel's here, I said, the words coming out strangled. He's parked outside. I think he may have been watching. Louise's expression hardened in a way I'd never seen before. For the first time, I fully understood that she knew exactly what kind of man my husband was. How do you want to handle this? I need to act normal. Surprised but happy to see him. I smoothed my hair and tried to control my breathing. Can you cover for me if he asks about my lunch break? Of course. You went to the deli down the street. Took a little longer because they were busy. I nodded, grabbed a random armload of files from the processing cart, and walked toward the front entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see Daniel getting out of his car, straightening his tie with the careful precision he brought to everything. When I emerged from the library, I arranged my face into what I hoped looked like pleasant surprise. Daniel, what are you doing here? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Meeting ended sooner than expected. Thought my beautiful wife might like to have lunch with her husband. The possessive emphasis on husband made my skin crawl, but I smiled back. That's so thoughtful. I actually just finished eating, though. Grabbed a sandwich from Morton's Deli. Which sandwich? The question was casual, conversational, but I recognized the trap. Daniel had a way of asking innocent questions that weren't innocent at all, gathering information to cross-reference later. Turkey and Swiss, I said, choosing something I'd ordered there before. With that mustard I like. He nodded, apparently satisfied, but I caught him glancing at his watch. Calculating timing, probably. How long would it take to walk to Morton's Deli, order food, eat, and return? Well, since you've already eaten, he said. Maybe you'd like to come home early today? We could spend some quality time together. I'd love to, but Louise is swamped. I promised I'd help with the children's section reorganization. The lie came easier this time, building on the foundation I'd established that morning. Mia. His voice carried a note of gentle reproach that I'd heard thousands of times before. You know I support your work, but sometimes I feel like you prioritize everything else over our marriage. Other people were walking past us on the sidewalk, library patrons, shoppers from nearby stores, normal people living normal lives. To them, we probably looked like any married couple having a minor disagreement. They couldn't see the undercurrents, the careful choreography of control and resistance. That's not true, I said softly. You're the most important thing in my life. The words tasted like ash, but they were what he needed to hear. Daniel's expression softened, and he reached out to touch my cheek in that gesture I'd once found romantic and now experienced as a claim of ownership. I know you don't mean to make me feel neglected, he said. You have such a generous heart, always wanting to help everyone. But sometimes I think you forget that charity begins at home. I don't forget. Good. He leaned down and kissed my forehead, his lips lingering a moment longer than necessary. I'll see you tonight then. Don't be too late. It wasn't a request. I watched him drive away, maintaining my composure until his car disappeared around the corner. Only then did I allow myself to sag against the library's brick wall, my legs suddenly unsteady. He knew. Maybe not specifics, but he sensed something. The surveillance would only intensify from here. Back inside, Louise took one look at my face and guided me to her office, closing the door behind us. Sit, she said firmly. Talk to me. I think he suspects I'm planning something. The way he was watching, the questions about my lunch, the suggestion that I come home early, it's all about control. What did the lawyer say? I told her about my meeting with Patricia Morrison, about the legal options and the safety concerns. As I spoke, Louise's expression grew increasingly grave. You need to accelerate your timeline, she said when I finished. If Daniel is escalating his monitoring, waiting could be dangerous. But I'm not ready. I don't have a place to stay long term. I haven't reconnected with old friends. I don't even have my own bank account anymore. Honey, you may not have the luxury of being completely ready. Sometimes survival requires jumping before you can see where you're going to land. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of routine tasks performed by rote, while my mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. Every time the library door opened, I looked up expecting to see Daniel, but he didn't return. At 5:30, I gathered my things and began the drive home through Cleveland's early evening traffic. Our neighborhood looked particularly beautiful in the golden autumn light tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, the kind of place where people raised families and felt safe. Daniel's car was already in our driveway when I pulled up. Through our kitchen window, I could see him moving around, probably preparing dinner. Such a thoughtful husband, any neighbor would think. So devoted to his wife. Perfect timing, he called when I entered through the garage door. I made that pasta dish you love. The kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, warm and welcoming. Daniel had set the table with our good china, lit candles, opened a bottle of wine. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought he was trying to be romantic. But I did know better. This was performance, designed to reinforce the narrative of our happy marriage while simultaneously reminding me of everything I stood to lose by disrupting it. This is lovely, I said, accepting the glass of wine he offered. What's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to appreciate my wife? But there was something sharp in his smile. I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about how important it is that we understand each other. We sat down to dinner, and Daniel launched into what seemed like normal conversation about his day, his clients, neighborhood gossip. But underneath the casual chat, I felt him studying me, looking for cracks in my performance. Oh, I ran into Tom Patterson at the gas station, Daniel said, twirling pasta around his fork with deliberate precision. He mentioned seeing you walking on Cedar Road this afternoon. Said you looked like you were in a hurry. My blood turned to ice water, but I kept my expression neutral. Tom Patterson lived 3 houses down and had the neighborhood awareness of a security camera. I was running late getting back from lunch, I said, taking a sip of wine to buy myself time. You know how I hate keeping Louise waiting. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Funny thing, though. Tom said you were walking away from downtown, not toward the library. Almost like you were coming from the opposite direction. The pasta turned to sawdust in my mouth. I forced myself to swallow before responding. I took the long way back. Sometimes I need the extra air to clear my head. Of course. His smile was understanding, loving even. But his eyes remained cold and calculating. Though I have to say, darling, you've been needing a lot of head clearing lately. Maybe you should see Dr. Williams about adjusting your anxiety medication. Another trap. Another way to pathologize my behavior, to suggest that any deviation from his expectations was a symptom of illness rather than agency. I feel fine, I said carefully. Just the usual work stress. Still, it wouldn't hurt to have a checkup. I'll call Dr. Williams tomorrow and set up an appointment. It wasn't a suggestion. Daniel had a way of making decisions about my medical care, my schedule, my life, while framing them as concern for my well-being. By tomorrow afternoon, I'd have an appointment with a doctor who'd known Daniel for years and trusted his assessment of my mental state implicitly. The walls were closing in, and we both knew it. After dinner, Daniel suggested we watch a movie together, his arm around my shoulders as we settled onto the sofa. He chose a thriller about a woman who discovers her husband has been lying to her, the irony, so heavy I wondered if it was intentional. Halfway through the film, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a client's name. I need to take this, he said apologetically. It'll just be a few minutes. He walked toward his home office, phone already pressed to his ear, but I noticed he left the door slightly ajar. Close enough to monitor my activities, far enough to conduct private business. This was my chance, possibly my only chance. I slipped quietly upstairs to our bedroom and retrieved Patricia Morrison's business card from where I'd hidden it behind the mirror in my jewelry box. My hands shook as I dialed her direct number. Patricia Morrison. It's Mia, I whispered. I need to move forward. Now. What's happened? In rapid, quiet sentences, I explained Daniel's increased surveillance, the encounter at the library, his plans to involve my doctor. Patricia listened without interruption. We can have papers drawn up by Monday, she said when I finished. But Mia, once we file, the 30-day clock starts ticking, and your husband will be served within 48 hours. Are you prepared for his reaction? Below, I could hear Daniel's voice through the office door, professional and controlled. The same voice that had whispered threats in our basement, that had told me I'd never escape. I'm prepared to stop being afraid of him, I said. Good. Can you come to my office Monday morning? We'll need about 2 hours to complete all the paperwork. I work Monday morning. Colin's sick. This is more important than perfect attendance. She was right, of course, but the suggestion still felt revolutionary. When was the last time I prioritized my needs over maintaining the elaborate fiction of my normal life? What about after the papers are filed? I asked. Where do I go? We'll discuss that Monday. In the meantime, start gathering important documents, birth certificate, social security card, passport, any financial records you can access. Keep them somewhere Daniel won't find them. He goes through everything. Then be creative. A safety deposit box, maybe? Or give them to a trusted friend. I thought about Louise, about Stephanie, about the network of people who'd been quietly waiting for me to ask for help. I can figure something out. Mia, one more thing. Trust your instincts. If at any point between now and Monday you feel unsafe, don't wait. Call 911. Call me. Call someone. Promise me. Daniel's voice had stopped. The house was too quiet. I promise, I whispered, and ended the call just as I heard his footsteps on the stairs. I slipped the business card back behind the mirror and was sitting on the bed, apparently checking my email, when he appeared in the doorway. Sorry about that, he said. Client emergency. You know how it is. Of course. Everything okay? Just the usual chaos. People don't plan properly, then expect miracles when tax season arrives. He moved toward the dresser, beginning his nightly routine of emptying his pockets, hanging up his clothes with military precision. I watched him in the mirror, this man who'd been the center of my world for 8 years, who still looked like the person I'd fallen in love with but had somehow become a stranger. When had his protectiveness turned into possession? When had his love become a cage? "You seem tired," he said, meeting my eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Maybe you should get some rest." Another suggestion. It was only 9 o'clock, but Daniel had noticed that I seemed distracted, possibly even rebellious, and he wanted me contained for the evening. "You're right," I said. "It's been a long day." As I went through my own evening routine, washing my face, brushing my teeth, changing into the modest pajamas Daniel preferred, I felt like I was performing these actions for the last time. By next week, everything would be different. I'd either be free, or I'd be dealing with consequences I couldn't yet imagine. In bed, Daniel reached for me with practiced familiarity, his hands moving over my body like he was claiming territory. I submitted because resistance would raise questions, but inside, I felt detached from what was happening. This wasn't intimacy, it was ownership being exercised. Afterward, as Daniel slept beside me with one arm draped possessively across my waist, I stared at the ceiling and thought about Monday. About courage. About the difference between the life I'd been living and the life I deserved to live. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a train whistle freight cars carrying goods to places I'd never seen, people I'd never met. The sound filled me with an almost painful longing for movement, for possibility, for a future that belonged to me. 3 more days until Monday. 3 more days until I either found my freedom or lost everything trying. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to Daniel's controlled breathing and the distant promise of trains heading somewhere else, I realized I'd already made my choice. The basement conversation had been Daniel's declaration of war on my autonomy. Monday would be my declaration of independence. I closed my eyes and began to plan. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that makes everything seem possible. Daniel left for the office at his usual time, kissing my forehead and reminding me to call Dr. Williams about that appointment. "I will," I promised, knowing I'd be doing something entirely different with my Monday morning. After his car disappeared around the corner, I sat in our kitchen with my coffee and made a list of everything I needed to do before Monday. Important documents to gather, people to contact, arrangements to make. For the first time in years, I was making plans that were entirely my own. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello, Mrs. Mia Thompson?" "Yes. This is Janet from Dr. Williams' office. Your husband called this morning to schedule an appointment for you. We have an opening Monday at 10 a.m. Will that work?" My carefully constructed plans suddenly felt fragile. Daniel was moving faster than I'd anticipated, tightening the noose before I could slip free of it. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "I'm going to need to call you back about scheduling. I may have a conflict Monday morning." "Oh, well, your husband seemed to think it was urgent. He mentioned you've been having some anxiety issues." The implication was clear. Anxious wives shouldn't be trusted to make their own medical decisions. Concerned husbands knew best. "I'll call back," I repeated firmly and hung up. This was it, the moment of no return. I was either going to reclaim my life on Monday morning, or I was going to spend the rest of it being managed by a man who believed he owned me. I thought about the basement, about Daniel's whispered threats, about the cold certainty in his eyes when he told me I'd never escape. We'd see about that. I picked up my phone and called Patricia Morrison's office. "I'd like to move our Monday appointment to first thing in the morning," I said when she answered. 8 a.m. if possible. "That's fine." Eager to get started. Eager to get free. There was something in my voice that must have convinced her I meant business, because when she spoke again, her tone was brisk and professional. "See you Monday at 8. And Mia, bring everything you can. Once we file these papers, there's no going back." "Good," I said. "I don't want to go back." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of our house and felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember, the exhilarating terror of someone about to jump off a cliff. Monday couldn't come fast enough.